Hey, in this video, we are going to get organized. Basically, all of our folders are going to end up looking beautiful and simple, and we're going to make sure that all of our game objects have proper zero-based transforms at the top of each of these hierarchy elements, and that everything is properly linked to prefabs. Every enemy and every player in every scene is linked correctly back to prefabs. So nice and organized and tidy and ready to build on. I love tidying things up, so I'm very much looking forward to this video. This is about how to collaborate with your designer. So I'm playing the part of you that's the developer if you're a single indie, and Rick is playing the other bit, the devil in your head, if you like, which is the designer inside you. So I'm going to be talking about how you organize your work, whether you're working on your own or with multiple people. It doesn't matter. The process is still roughly the same in terms of how we want to work. We're going to be teaching you a methodology that will work with when you work with somebody else, or it will serve you very well if you're working on your own. So let's start by talking about how to use this GameObject clear parent facility and why would we want to use that facility. So let me show you the problem first. If we don't establish conventions in the world, then things like this happen. We have enemies here as a root object, innocently created as an empty game object, just to organize these enemies into. One is missing, this Ethan here is missing, but that's okay. This object here, the idea of it is that it groups all these enemies together. Now note a few weird things. Firstly, one enemy is missing. But secondly, if you look at that enemy, it does not have a 0, 0, 0 transform. So what does that mean? Well, if you take, say, this enemy here, which is one of the sub-enemies, what's its transform? Well, it's a bit weird, isn't it? For a start, it's indicating a Y of under the ground here. Well, it's actually on the ground. Why is that? Well, because this 1.7 meters of the root object that's sitting here, hovering just above the ground's a bit thick, is adding to this guy's Y transform of minus 1.7 to give you the 0. Okay, not very convenient, because let's say I want to swap this guy out with something else. So say I say, okay, I'm going to swap him for, well, later it's going to be an enemy prefab, but say it's a cube right now. You ought to think I can just go copy component on this dude, and then I maybe come in and create a cube and go, oh, that's all very well, but let's paste component values on the cube. I would hope the cube would appear where the enemy is, but look, it appears under the floor, because it doesn't have this same offset. All right, so what's the solution to that once that's been done? Well, the solution is, in this case, quite simple. You select all the things in question. Make sure that before you do this, that everything else in your hierarchy, i.e. all this stuff, is pretty well organized. Otherwise, you may not be able to find the things that you bring out of this folder effectively. But what you're effectively going to do is bring these things out of the folder. Now, you can just drag and bring them out of the folder like that. And observe Ethan1 now has an X of minus 3.39. I'm going to use Control Z to compare that to going GameObject, clear parent. Now what does Ethan1 have? The same, minus 3.39. So it's broadly the same thing, just dragging out of enemies or selecting them all and saying clear parent. Right, now what I'm going to do is reset the enemies transform. So that whenever we make an empty like enemies for organizational purposes, we want, and environment, the same thing would apply to environment. We're going to have to sort that one out as well. But let's deal with enemies for the moment. You want a 0, 0, 0 transform. Then you go grab all your enemies and bring them in. And that's step 1. Now, if I was to take the same enemy on the right-hand side, copy his component, stick a cube in the scene as a test case and paste component values, sits right on the enemy, just what we want, okay? So they're where they say they are when you click on them. That's the point with these guys. All right, so next challenge is to sort the environment out, and then we'll go on to the next level. So again, these environment blocks, they're all very well, nicely organized in the environment, but we want a convention where the root object has a 0 transform. So how do we sort that out? Well, again, you want to make sure the place you're going to is quite clean, i.e. the upper hierarchy, this lot, otherwise you may lose them. And then we can try the other method this time, is I drag them out, I reset my environment, and I bring them all back in. Now that has the benefit that I haven't actually moved anything. It's all in the same place in the world, but all these transform values have now been updated. Okay, so that is cool. That is cool, and that is done. Now we want to move on to something else, which is talking about separating player and enemy prefabs. We'll also look at block prefabs while we're at it. Prefabs in general. Cool. So blocks. Let's start with blocks. This is a pretty one-off block. This thing here, I'm going to call it a inspiration screen or something. Great, but then the rest of these blocks, if I select their prefab, what are they linked to? They do all appear to be linked to the same block. Now, one easy way you could tell is you could right-click on the block prefab down here and say find references in scene. Look what that does. It makes everything else black and white and slightly transparent and shows you the references. And you can see that all the blocks are indeed linked to this prefab, which is pretty cool. It comes up here as a search, ref::block.prefab. So that's a useful tip and shows you that Rick has used this block prefab for all of the blocks. That's cool. So they're in good shape. Now let's look at the enemies next, moving upwards. Are these enemies linked to a prefab? Well, if we were to select prefab, what does it say? Well, it's not even a prefab, actually. This is an FBX. Be very careful of that. That is, it looks different on the right-hand side, doesn't it? It's not even a game object. It doesn't even have a transform. It's an FBX, which is a 3D model, which is imported by Unity. So what's happened here is that the designer has just dropped in a model rather than a prefab for the enemy. So easy mistake to make. So at this stage, how do we sort that out? Well, it depends on how many enemies there are. If there are tons, we may need to use some script. If these enemies don't matter, and Rick has said to me these don't matter, no problem. For the purpose of this video, I can just delete them all. So I could just delete them. But let me just go one stage further with a couple of them rather than deleting them all. Because the work we did a moment ago to make sure that the enemies were all correctly transformed and positioned means that we can do this. Number one, we can make an enemy prefab. So let's do that and do that in your project. You want to duplicate the third person character prefab under standard assets, characters, third person character prefabs. You can always see the directory just above here that I'm talking about. So we want to duplicate that, and one easy way is from the edit menu, duplicate. I'm going to call the duplicate enemy. Now, before we move any further, is this suitable as an enemy? Well, no. We don't want a third-person user controller script on an enemy because we are not going to move it ourselves. We're going to let script move the enemies later, so we can remove that, and we can remove player movement because that's obviously not needed either because it's not the player. It's becoming an enemy. So we're specializing this guy a little bit. I've actually made a mistake as well because we haven't been teaching you about this collaboration and prefabbing. I've been working on the third-person character, which is why it's got a player movement script on it. Shouldn't have, really, should it? It's a standard asset. Should never have added it to it. But let's deal with the enemy for now. So we remove the player movement script. So now we're down to something that's much more like an enemy. Now let's instantiate one of these guys and see what the issue is. He looks all right. He could do with a rotation. And if Rick is saying this is the size he wants for his enemies, then we're going to need to scale down to roughly the same size. It doesn't have to be precise because we know at this stage in the project, Rick is only just kind of doing early placeholders. So it's got roughly the same size, roughly the same style. We also, now we can move him. It doesn't really matter when we do this, but you can move the enemy into assets because over there we have a red enemy material. So I can open up the enemy, apply the material to the Ethan body part of the enemy, and then it's not until you save that this thumbnail updates. That means we're now getting red enemies. Now, why is this enemy rotated and unscaled, or unrotated and unscaled? Because the instance I've been working on, I have not applied. Remember that? Always got to apply it back to the prefab. Cool, so now we have an enemy that can come into the scene, drop down like that, and be roughly the same sort of size scale, broadly speaking. I can make it a bit bigger, apply, and it is going to look right and be facing in roughly the right direction. Now, Rick has also scaled these guys, which means that when they move, their skeletal animation will not work properly at all, but that's going to be really funny, and that'll be absolutely fine for now. So I've got my enemy prefab now. The question is, how do I swap this guy, which is a model? It's not a prefab at all. It's not a proper prefab. How do I swap it out for this enemy prefab? Well, it's quite simple. So we do what we did before. We copy the component, drop an enemy in the scene, and you just paste the component values. Goes right over the top of the other enemy. We now can delete the other enemy and put this new enemy in place. There you go. So now I've swapped it out. If I say select prefab on this dude, then we find it is actually, well, hold on, let's get the right dude. This enemy here, if I select prefab, you can see it's actually our enemy prefab. Awesome. So because the rest of these really should be linked to prefabs, and I can't be bothered to do what I've just done another 5 times, I'm actually just going to delete them with one piece of inspiration before I do, which is the last enemy, the large enemy. So I'm going to get rid of the little guys and say to myself, well, look, the designer's already saying they want a large enemy. Oops, let's not delete the whole ground plane. That would suck somewhat. So the designer's saying we want a large enemy. So give them a large enemy, right? Let's go to enemy. We'll tidy up this folder in a minute. Let's just duplicate it again in this particular case. And let's give them a large enemy. Enemy large. Or large enemy. Speak English. Use folders to organize by things like enemy. So now I can pop large enemy in the scene and go, well, he's pretty close, but large enemy should be large. So let's make him large. He looks good as a large enemy. Now, again, I can swap this guy out. In this particular case, I can copy the component, delete the big baddie, we've already got a large enemy, so I can just paste component values, and we get a large enemy in the same place. Awesome. So hopefully that makes sense. Organize large enemy into enemies. Everything's looking good. Environment has a 0 transform. Enemies has a 0 transform. These guys are, if we select prefab, linked to prefab. Select prefab, select prefab. Really good. All right, that's important. Now the final thing is we want to make sure that the player is linked to a player prefab. It isn't. Now I've kind of accidentally made this thing here a player. So that's okay. I'll just work with it. I'm just going to move it now to the root. And the third person character is going to become my player. And in this point, it's absolutely fine. It is actually the player prefab right now. We can drop him in the scene, and it's all fine. So the other thing I want to check on the enemy prefab, by the way, on both these enemy prefabs, is that they do not have the tag with player, and they did. So let's take that off, okay? You want no player tag on the enemy prefabs. Now, I'm making that change direct on the prefabs. If you're making it on instances, you're going to have to apply it. Now, let's test this works by just moving around, or clicking around in this case. WSA&D is not compatible with the mouse movement right now. We've got these dudes doing this weird, wicked stress squat, and they're sliding around, but they are working, and we're only moving the main player, which is the key here. The other test that's always good to do is delete the player and drop it back in the scene. It should work that easily. Your player should just work. Cool. So the player's prefab, the enemies are prefab. Let's switch over to my combat sandbox. So in my combat sandbox, I just have me. Let's drop a small enemy in and see how these two work. Yep, my player's moving and the enemy's sitting there. That all feels good. Let's delete and re-add my player just to make, or just check that the player is linked to the prefab. All good. So the point here is that both scenes are pointing to the same prefabs and that everything's instantiating and working correctly. Awesome. So the final thing to do in this video, before I challenge you, by the way, to just do this for your own project. So if you're not doing this as you go along, you're going to have time at the end to organize and tidy up your own project. I want to talk to you about folder structures now. So it's a really important topic, and it'll look lovely when we finish with it. I'm going to recommend that you don't bother organizing your folders by material, mesh, model in general. There will be some organization like that, particularly scenes, and we'll be using the word material as well. But in general, we may as well add some more value than that. We might as well talk about game objects, right? So one thing that we can factor out of here is scenes. Because we've got Combat Sandbox and Rick's Village, and then we've got the blocks and the block material and this screenshot. All that stuff is purely about scenes, right? So that goes in a scene, so is the ground. Great. Materials, if we look at it, these are screenshots and stuff that are related to Rick's scenes. So again, they can go inside the scenes folder. So we can just take materials, pop it in scenes. So that everything to do with scenes is in scenes. Good news. All right, we will do some further organization of scenes later, but for now, this is fine. As soon as you get a few things that are only about Rick's village, like for instance this screenshot, then we can factor it out further. But let's just keep it simple for now. Only create the number of folders you need. Now we've got stuff about camera and cursors and camera raycasters. That's all about, I'm going to call it camera and UI for now. And again, you're free in Unity to just move things around. So all that stuff, camera, raycaster, etc., into camera and UI. The other thing we've already got now is we've got a genuine player theme going on, I think. Because we have a player movement script. And then I think we also probably have an NPC or enemies. What is an NPC and is an enemy an NPC? Yes, in that it's a non-player controller, but I think Rick would prefer to have enemies and NPCs separate. NPCs are people we don't fight, basically. And all the stuff to do with the enemies goes in there. Now we don't need a folder for this utility, because there's only one of them. So much tidier, right? Everything kind of sings together. So that's how I suggest you organize your folders. If you ever want to say find all scripts, you just go here, this little dot, and just say script. Simple as that. Okay, so why bother using that folder hierarchy? Why not group things by logical units? It's also easier to export them and use them if your player and their script are together. Then when you come to export, you're just exporting those two from that folder. If you drop the dependencies, you're just effectively exporting the player folder. So that's it. That's all I want to say. So what you want to do now, or I don't know if you want to do this, but I'd like you to, is to organize your project. You should end up with just enough folders, no more than you need. Have a second scene, maybe level sandbox to follow along. You probably already have that from what Rick does. And all players, prefabs, and cameras should be linked to the correct prefab. All right, we didn't actually check my camera, so I'll do that after the challenge. But you go ahead, make sure everything's prefabbed and working, and I'll see you in a minute. Okay, welcome back. Now, hopefully also share a screenshot of your work. That would be cool. If you've done anything at all cool, share a screenshot over on our forum. That would be fantastic. All right, so the final thing I want to check is the camera arm. Is that prefab working and ready to go? So let's select the prefab. Select it in the hierarchy, select prefab. It does look like this one is using the prefab. Let's go over to Rick's scene. Nice and easy to find now. Select prefab. Yep, everything looks like it's linked to the correct prefab. So everything's good. The other thing I would say is that the main camera prefab should probably be tagged main camera. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Make sure your main camera prefab is tagged. And we are finally done. We have a warning here about something that's not used, but we will use that in a few videos' time. It's not a problem.